Okay, so today we're going to talk about the presidential election of 2024. And that election is a little bit more than 6 months away. And in politics, 6 months is a lifetime. So we don't know what really is going to happen in November, but we can predict a few things. And so what I'm going to do today is divide my presentation into three parts. The first, we'll talk about what some of the main issues, not all the issues, but some of the main issues surrounding the campaign are. Second, we're going to look at the polls. What do they say now as far as who's winning, who's not winning, why? And then thirdly, I will try to offer a prediction. I know it kind of undermines what I just said about predicting too far in advance, but we'll give it a shot. We'll look at where the race is now and offer some insight as to what might happen in November. Okay. And after that, of course, I'll open it up to comments or questions you have. I'll probably speak for about 30 minutes, and that'll give us more than enough time to have a back and forth discussion. So first off, the issues. Like most presidential elections, I'd say 90% of them, it's the economy that really affects the way people think about voting. And particularly this election cycle, it's inflation that is really weighing on the American people. I've got a few graphs here that show what that means. And here is a roughly 4-year graph of how inflation has climbed. And it's gone way up starting around April of 2021. It reached its height sometime in the late summer of 2022 at 9.1%. That means prices year over year were higher at 9.1% than they were a year before. And that's a pretty significant increase for the American people, many of whom see that in their grocery prices at the gas station, and utilities, a host of things are affected by it. Inflation kills economies. That's pretty much a golden rule, that it's a tax on everything we spend on. And that is why it's becoming such a hardcore issue for this presidential race. Here's another look which gives you some insight into how it may affect politics. You'll see after 2020, when President Biden took office, that number spiked. And although it's gone down, it still remains fairly high in comparison to the previous few years. And it's that spike upward that has impacted the thinking of the American people when it comes to inflation. And sometimes there's a lagging effect too. Even if prices go down, it takes a while for Americans to realize that in their wallets. And so it doesn't necessarily matter what the numbers are now, it's how Americans are feeling, which again lags behind by a few months at least. And finally, there's another graph here which predicts inflation over the next several months into 2025 and beyond. And you can see from the caption there that inflation is expected to remain elevated, not at its high of, 9.1% of a couple of years ago, but elevated through 2025. So as far as inflation goes, it's poor timing for Joe Biden. And so since the economy broadly and inflation specifically impacts the way people think, you can see where I'm going with that. It's never a good sign for the incumbent, the person in power, when the economy is taking its toll on the American people. That is a clear issue. Again, Americans vote with their wallets more than any other single issue. That doesn't mean other issues cannot have an impact, and they certainly will. But the economy is always, or almost always, number one. Another issue that has been a factor in this election cycle is the border and immigration in general, but specifically immigration at the border. Now, some refer to this as illegal immigration. I'm not comfortable with that word. We can use undocumented workers. Whatever word we use. The fact is that in the last 3 years, millions of people have come across the border, and a lot of those people are poor. They're in need of assistance. That's why they're here in the first place. But there can be a small percentage, but significant percentage of those who are unchecked. We don't know much about them, and it ties into terrorism. The conservatives and Republicans certainly have made a big deal of the border crisis. In fact, the Democrats and Republicans can't agree on what it is, whether it's a crisis or something else. And that shows how far apart the two parties are when it comes to immigration. But it's taken its toll on the American people, and it's not just a border issue, because a lot of those immigrants have migrated inward into the country in every direction, as far north as Massachusetts and as far west as California and Washington. And so it's a national issue. And I think Republicans have done a very good job making it a national issue, and one of the top issues that the country faces when it comes to the election of 2024. So the border specifically and immigration broadly is seen in virtually every survey taken as one of the top 2 or 3 issues. And if it remains that way, it may not over the next several months, my sense is it will, then it will impact the election. A third issue that's been mentioned many, many times is threats to democracy. And that's most explicated and illustrated in the January 6, 2021 insurrection or riots. Again, different parties, different groups use different words, but it was a bad thing. It was an ugly day, as you know. Many of the perpetrators have either been prosecuted or are on the verge of being prosecuted, and that has culminated in the prosecution of Donald Trump for January 6th and what his role is. And while both parties disagree on what his role is exactly, the fact is that one of the indictments that he's been charged with has to do with January 6th. But that the Democrats certainly have posed as a threat to democracy. It's been well established by Trump's opposition that he is an authoritarian leader. He doesn't believe in democratic institutions, and he'll do anything to obtain power, or as it were on January 2021, to stay in power. Whatever the case may be, that's been perceived as a threat to democracy, and as such is an existential threat. The very existence of the country is connected to this issue. It's a very real thing. And one of my big fears, in fact, is what will happen after the election in November. Whoever wins, there's going to be people unhappy. And the extent of their unhappiness, I hope, does not play out in the streets of America, but that will also pose a threat. Another issue is abortion. Usually, cultural, social issues, they don't take center stage. And I wouldn't say this is a top issue, but Democrats have certainly reminded the American people that Roe versus Wade, that is the Supreme Court decision of 1973 that gave women a right to an abortion, that it was overturned a couple of years back by Dobbs versus Mississippi. And it essentially, this latest decision by the Supreme Court, left it to the states to determine whether a woman has the right to choose and when. And a lot of states, particularly in the South, have trimmed that right down to 6 weeks, the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, and then they don't have a right. And other states have even indicated that they're going to remove the right to an abortion altogether. So reproductive rights are on the ballot. And it seems that this was a winning strategy for Democrats in the congressional elections of 2022, and certainly they're trying to employ that again, and I think they're having some success. And of course, the conservatives and Republicans in states like Arizona, they keep feeding the Democrats with making decisions that run counter to where most Americans are. I think in Arizona, not only are they trying to outlaw abortion altogether, but in vitro fertilization has been made illegal in some of these states. So it's a big, big deal for lots of women in particular, but also men. And abortion rights are on the ballot too as a result. Other social issues as well, but this is the main one. And finally, I would say in the top 5 of all these issues is foreign policy. Foreign policy in normal times doesn't sway an election one way or the other. These are not normal times. And we're not in a normal period of foreign policy. We've got 2 wars going on in the world. They are quite horrific in their scope, and you get a little bit from the media about them. And those 2 are in Gaza, where the Israeli military has responded to the Hamas attacks of October 7th, 2023. And some say, perhaps many say, that the military has disproportionately responded by killing civilians, and Hamas is certainly not as powerful as it may have been, but nonetheless, it's civilians that are being killed, and it's become quite controversial. And that controversy, as you might know, has spilled into America. College campuses are protesting Israeli policy in one way or another. The other foreign policy situation is Ukraine. Now, I will say, and Mark, you know this more than I do, but Ukraine has been placed on a back burner. I don't think we get nearly as much attention on what the Russians are doing in Ukraine as we did maybe a couple of years ago. But nonetheless, whether America funds Ukraine's response to Russia invading its country, to what extent, that's become a political issue. So collectively, Gaza and Ukraine do matter. How the Biden administration has handled this, whether it's flubbed the Ukraine response or the Israeli response to Hamas, those are things that the American people are weighing. They're considering that. And it promises to be a significant, though not the top issue. So to me, that's the way I see the issues. Those are the 5 that are most pressing, with inflation and the economy being the number 1 issue. Now, secondly, let's talk about the polls. So those are the issues, but what are the American people saying right now as far as the polls are concerned? Well, the short story is that it's too close to call. It's a tight race. And this is a poll that I just got from yesterday. This is a Pew Research Center poll, very recent. It's as recent as I could find. And you'll see the very top where all voters, registered voters, either are voting for Biden or are leaning Biden or voting for Trump or leaning Trump. And it's 49% to 48%. Very close. And if you break it down by group, all the way down, including men and women, ethnicity, age, education, you can see that all of that together means it's going to be a very close election, as many of them have been recently, dating all the way back to the 2000 election. So you can't really gather any real sense from the polls. But just remember also, polls, and here are a few others that present a very close election. Polls are only a snapshot. They don't predict anything. They just tell you how it is now. Anything can happen. Many things will happen over the next 6 months to sway the electorate one way or another. And sometimes it goes back and forth. That's what's been happening, actually, over the last many weeks and months. It seemed that Trump had a clear lead a few weeks ago. Now it seems, according to some of these polls, that Biden is tightening the race somewhat, maybe even overtaking Trump in some of these polls. But you also have to keep in mind, when we talk about polls, we're talking about what's called a margin of error. And so you'll see that the larger number of people who respond to polls, the smaller the margin of error. And usually you'll find a good poll roughly 3% within the margin of error. That means if it's 49 to 48 Trump, the real numbers could be 46 to 51 Biden. Or it could be 52 to 45 Trump. It could swing that much in one direction or the other. And so margin of error, when you see polls, look at that margin of error and what it means. It means that polls are not only just a reflection, a picture of how things are, but they're not entirely accurate. They're not wholly reliable. They just give us a sense of who's winning. Also, polls over time are a good idea because they capture the trends. And that's what we want to see in politics, what the trends are, not what things are as we speak. The other thing is that when we talk about who's winning nationally, in a sense, that doesn't matter, right? Because as you should know, I hope you know, the election, the presidential election is decided on a state-by-state basis. It's the electoral map that matters. So the way the Electoral College works, without spending too much time on it here, is that every state votes, and based on their populations, they get a certain number of electoral votes. Does anyone know how many Connecticut has?
7.
Good job, 7. You must have taken my American government class before.
Yeah.
That's why he knows. What's the most populous state and therefore the most California with?
4.
Wrong.
Oh, yeah.
55. It went up.
They updated it.
They did.
The census.
It's 55 now. All right.
I can check.
Fine. Whatever. You could be right. I may be wrong. But anyway, California is the most populous, has the most electoral votes. And what happens is all the electoral votes are counted. Whoever gets to 270, the majority, wins. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what's happening nationally. What's more important is what is happening state by state. Now, there's something called the swing states. You may have heard of this term. Swing states mean that the election in these states is very close, could go either way. Historically, the states that have gone either way, at least in recent history, are Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida. I will tell you this, according to the latest polls, there has been some movement in a couple of these states. We could add Georgia, by the way, to a swing state, but Florida has gone more red, more to the Republican side in recent years, whereas Nevada more blue. So swing states, year to year, election to election, they do change, but historically, over the last 20 years, these are the swing states that will determine the election. So you may have noticed, by the way, that nationally, in 2016, Hillary Clinton got more national votes than Trump, but she lost the Electoral College, which led many to say, let's scrap the Electoral College altogether and just do a national vote. That has its problems too. There's no foolproof system. But in any case, these swing states are going to matter. If you're interested in the election, look at Wisconsin, Michigan, even Ohio could be a swing state, but Pennsylvania, Georgia's going to matter. In the West, Arizona, Nevada, not so much Colorado, that's gone more blue. Nevada and Arizona in particular. So the swing states will determine the winner of this election. There's another factor. We haven't talked about him, but another thing that's making it hard to predict is the presence of this third-party candidate. Who is this?
RFK, Robert F. Kennedy.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., right. He's got a very well-known, famous name, so he's got name recognition. He is a Kennedy. That matters in politics, although much of his family has kind of disowned him because most of his family are Biden supporters. But he's running in the election as a third-party candidate. And there's a big question mark as to two things. Number one, where is he going to get on the ballot? This is done state by state too. And so he needs a certain number of signatures in each state in order to be a third-party option. Whether he gets there in how many states, no one really knows. It looks like he's having some success in Utah and a few states in the West, which may prove to be significant. But how that's going to look come election day is hard to determine. The other thing about Robert Kennedy is that he seems to be polling fairly well. He's gotten anywhere from 7% of the overall vote to about 12, 13%. And that means, although he's not going to win the election, it means he will sway the election one way or the other, toward Trump or toward Biden. That's the big question. Even my fellow historian in the social sciences, he and I have debated who he hurts more. Does the presence of RFK hurt Trump more or Biden more? It seems to me he's hurting Biden more because he's big on the environment. Democrats and liberals tend to be big on the environment. He's a Kennedy. You kind of vote, when you're a Democrat, you vote for Kennedy. But on the other hand, he's also promoted these conspiracy theories about vaccines, Kennedy has, and that kind of trends toward Trump supporters. And so it's a mixed bag, but that remains a big question, the impact of Robert Kennedy. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages for both candidates. Biden, his numbers have improved over the last few weeks, as I've said. The race has tightened, or he's surpassed Trump in a lot of these swing states. He's got that going for him. He's the incumbent, meaning he's in power now. It's a lot easier to run for re-election to get elected if you're Trump. I guess that's a re-election of some kind too, but he's been out of power for 4 years. So that is advantage Biden. Another advantage to Biden is early voting. Democrats are much better at early voting, mail-in voting. They have proved to be much more successful at it than Republicans and conservatives who tend to be weary of early voting. In fact, an entire conspiracy that it was a fraudulent election of 2020 centered around the whole concept of early voting. But since Biden supporters are better at it, I think that's a pretty big advantage, and not many people have talked about that lately. Now, of course, Trump has some advantages. I mentioned the economy. Now, this is a little tricky because the economy wasn't perfect under Trump, but that's the way lots of Americans seem to remember it, that it was much better then than it is now. Inflation was tame. Now it's accelerated. Unemployment was low, still is low. Doesn't seem to matter as much anymore to a lot of Americans. They seem to be taking inflation into account and leaving all other factors regarding the economy out of the equation. And that gives an advantage to Donald Trump. So there's a sense of nostalgia, believe it or not, for some. Surveys demonstrate this, that the Trump years were the good old days. I remember the chaos too, so I wouldn't go that far. But anyway, that's the impression that's out there. In politics, perception is everything. I would also say that another Trump advantage is the indictment effect, I'll call it. In other words, he's been indicted 93 times. Statewide, federal charges from New York to Georgia, indictments for different reasons. I'm not going to get into the reasons why, but he is going to be and has been on trial. And we live in strange times. That has actually helped him, it seems. The indictment effect means that his supporters have become more loyal, that there's a sense of outrage that he's unfairly being prosecuted. If you listen to Trump, by the way, the word that he'll use most often is unfair. And I think a lot of his supporters are buying into it. Now, the question is where independents stand as far as the indictment effect is concerned. If independents perceive that Trump is being targeted politically, that these are not legitimate charges, then those independents may swing in his favor in these key battleground states. And so that indictment effect, I think, is real as well. It seems like every time he's been indicted, his poll numbers either go up slightly or they stay about the same. They have not gone down because of the indictments. As I said, we live in very strange times. There's something else to that, very quickly. Americans love to stick it to people in power. There's been a long tradition of this. And I think voting for Trump is a way to do that. Even though he himself was in power and is a powerful figure, I recall Marion Barry. He was the mayor of Washington, D.C., who had, I think, federal drug charges against him, who was incarcerated, and then was reelected mayor. And I get the sense that Americans just love to elect people when they get in trouble by the big guy, those in power. We can call that what we wish, but it's a real phenomenon. Anyway, regardless of these advantages and disadvantages, it's a toss-up. And I think the main reason it's a toss-up is because neither one of these candidates is very desirable. Poll after poll after poll tells us that the American people wish there was just somebody else running, that these are not the first choices. And how did we get here? That's a question we hear a lot as well. All right, so those are the factors I see. What about a prediction? I'll just offer one, just kind of have fun with it more than anything, because I don't know. Based on what I've observed, based on what I've seen, I think that Trump's going to win. Now, let me preface that by saying that there could be big surprises. I wouldn't put it past this country to have some October surprise. I would say that it's even quite possible, if the Democrats see that Trump is winning in these battleground states, to replace Biden with someone else. I think that the Democrats are in this will do anything to not let Trump win sentiment right now. It's very real. And if that means replacing Biden, they could even do it at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August. So it's not too late for something like that to happen. And on the other side, anything that's possible with Trump. He might be incarcerated by then, and then who knows what happens. So again, barring those unpredictable factors, I think Trump wins because inflation is stubbornly still too high for a lot of Americans. They're paying $3.70 at the gas station. Eggs are $3 where they were once $1.25. Utility bills are higher. In Connecticut, they promised to go even higher. So these are all factors that weigh on the American people. And if we go back to the political axiom that people vote with their wallets, then this is going to be the key issue. And it's going to be really hard for Biden to overcome it. I would also say, and I want to be careful here, but Biden's demeanor, his personality is not conducive to someone who is in charge. I think we see that if we just eliminate what conservatives say about Biden and watch him himself. We get the sense that he's not quite prepared. He makes too many mistakes as he's speaking. He doesn't remember, and his own Justice Department has insinuated that with that report that came out about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And that matters to people. Again, in politics, perception is everything. And I think that'll be a factor. I do think also the swing states will and are gravitating to Trump a little bit. They are most hit by inflation. Remember, inflation is like a regressive tax. What does that mean? It means it hurts the people who can least afford to be hurt by it. In those swing states where unemployment is higher than the national average, in states like Wisconsin, or Rory's just outraged at my prediction, so he just had to leave, apparently. But in those swing states where job loss and inflation hurts the most, that is where I think Trump has an advantage. I would also say one final thing before I open it up to questions and comments. There is this narrative that there's just too much chaos around now, that things are spinning out of control. Not that they weren't during the Trump years. The Trump years carried on a chaos of its own, as we know. But the chaos here is taken to college campuses in the form of protests. And regardless of what your opinions are of these protests, I think most Americans perceive this as what is going on here? Why are people so angry, so frustrated? And when there is that perception of chaos, protests, war, polarization, it tends to be bad news for the incumbent. And I think that's where we are. So my prediction is, barring a surprise of some kind, and I wouldn't be too surprised if there were surprises, but barring that, I think Trump is going to win. So be prepared to the extent that you would be unhappy with that outcome. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Now, I didn't mean to be rude to Kelly because I know she had her hand up. So I want to get to you first before we get to questions. What did you have to say, Kelly? Kelly, by the way, has helped me organize these, and so she should be thanked for that. But yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, the only thing I was going to say is you were talking about events and all those things coming up. I just thought it was a good plug for Law Day and our final event.
Absolutely. Why don't we plug that at the end of this before everyone goes? Absolutely. That's going to be an exciting day as well. So if you do have questions or comments, I'd be happy to hear from you. We can just have a carefree discussion from this point on. Anybody want to start the conversation? Absolutely.
So just on the topic of pro-Palestine protests.
Yes.
We know from the first session, like in states like Michigan, a lot of people were voting, uncommitted.
Yes.
And
factor.
there was a clip going around at a Trump rally where people were chanting Genocide Joe, and he was like, that's not wrong. Do you think he's possibly trying to get some of the pro-Palestine vote from people who are maybe closer to the center?
When you say he, you mean Trump?
Yeah.
I don't know that he has any notion that he's going to get those votes, but what I do think is he wants to reinforce the uncommitted idea that, in fact, you don't necessarily have to vote for Trump, but just don't vote for Biden. And you're absolutely right to bring that point up. In a lot of these states that held their primaries, a good chunk of the electorate voted uncommitted rather than voting for Joe Biden. And if those people stay home in November, that too will give Trump an advantage. And I think many of those uncommitteds stem from Biden's policies in the Middle East, that he's too cozy with Israel. I know he's tried to distance himself from Israel to some extent, but America has been wedded to Israel for a long time, and it's hard to get rid of that relationship with words and a few deeds here and there. So I think overall, that is a big factor. You're absolutely right to bring that up. If we could just pass the mic around.
Now I do have something to say based on what he just said. If we think about the uncommitted and we talk about them saying Genocide Joe, it also starts to bring about what happened with the pullout of Afghanistan. There's a lot of units, a lot of veteran organizations, and the family members of those that lost at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan during the pullout. And a lot of them are going against Joe Biden, who may at one point have been supporters of his. So if you take a look at the axes that we talked about earlier with foreign policy, we look at what's going on in Israel and Gaza, we look at what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen, we look at all of these external things. Don't forget that during this last 4 years, we also had the pullout of Afghanistan, which is a complete debacle, at least from what we can see here.
Right.
And there were military officers losing their jobs because they chose to speak out. And when people start to lose their jobs because they choose to speak out, we have to look at that a little bit deeper and figure out why. Because
Right.
most people are not going to take their career and throw it away for something they don't believe in.
I think the good point, the Afghanistan pullout, it seems like a lifetime ago, but nonetheless, it's kind of connected to more current issues of Biden's overall foreign policy. And again, it speaks to this idea that Biden isn't particularly a strong leader. I think that's the narrative. Again, I hold no opinion on that, but I think a lot of Americans, if you look at the polls and some surveys taken, that is the thing they criticize Biden for. He doesn't take the initiative. He's not clear on his policies. Afghanistan was a reflection of that, I think. But, when Trump was in power, I don't know that we had a very systematized, organized foreign policy either. And so it could hit both of these candidates pretty hard when we talk about foreign policy.
I would
I know
definitely
that
agree with that.
that Trump supporters do like to say there were no wars when Trump was president. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I don't know if it's because Trump that we didn't have wars the way we do now. I think the overall sense that the world is kind of coming apart at the seams is something that will impinge upon Biden since he's the president right now. Any
I would
other
definitely agree
questions
with
or
that.
comments? There's one. If we can pass the mic. Eric?
So as you know, or probably heard of as well, Trump has been meeting with presidents around the world of different countries, for example, of Argentina, of Poland. Do you believe that these countries and other foreign countries are going to fluctuate the election and their support? And which president would they rather see lead the country?
Right. I think it depends on the country. The countries you mentioned have conservative, some would even say authoritarian leaders. Argentina and Poland. You might also mention, is it Hungary, who's got another authoritarian leader. So Trump has indeed, as you say, approached these leaders to try to galvanize some international support. I do think overall, though, Biden has a bit of an advantage in terms of how most countries America is allied with in terms of international support. I think Biden, though he's older now, maybe not as sharp as he once was, I do think he has the support of France and Germany. And a lot of those countries don't like the unpredictability of Trump. So that's the way I would see that. But as far as Argentina, also Brazil is one. I don't know if you mentioned Brazil, but these are all countries that are now being governed from the right. And it leads to this idea that Trump is in league with these other kind of authoritarian leaders who govern too strongly, taking away people's civil liberties, that kind of thing. And if I were the Biden administration, I would use that as a way of saying, look, Trump is too unpredictable foreign policy-wise. He's connecting himself too much to these authoritarian, dangerous leaders. I don't know that the Biden administration has done that at all. So anyway, that's my thought on that. Any other questions, comments? Are we done? Are you so disenchanted with my prediction that you can't even go on anymore? I've stunned you. It's only my prediction. Who am I, though? I don't have any special expertise other than what I've described. Oh, we do have another question. Yes, absolutely.
Do you think there's anybody in terms of like the Democrat sphere of influence or the Republican sphere of influence who could possibly take over the candidacy if something happens to Biden or Trump?
Well, let me ask you this. Are you pleased with Biden or Trump? Are you one of those
No.
majority? You don't want either one? You
I
don't
do
like-
not want either of them.
Okay, and I think you reflect the opinion of lots of people. Well, I think Trump has the support of the Republicans. He's solidified that. There's no challenger. They've done the primaries. Nikki Haley had a chance. She lost. Ron DeSantis had an opportunity, but he lost to Trump in the primaries. So Trump has solidified that. Short of something incredible happening, like really bad, like an assassination, Trump's got it. On the Biden, and I'm not suggesting that he's going to be assassinated. On the Biden side, I think, again, as we approach the early midsummer, if the poll numbers do not look good for him, I still think there is this movement that will perhaps lead to his replacement. The percentages of that are low, but even 10, 15, 20%, it's a pretty high number at this point. You'd think that the guy who got the nomination is going to sail through the convention and battle against Trump in November. So it's a low percentage, but it's a significant percentage. And if that happens, well, I could see Gavin Newsom, California governor, maybe replacing him. They say that he's portending to be a presidential candidate. It's like he's playing the role of it, even though he says, I'm a big supporter of Biden. So it could be him. I've heard Michelle Obama's name thrown around as a possible replacement. One problem with that is she has no desire to be president, as far as I can tell from what I've heard. They did have a challenger to Biden. His name was Dean Phillips from Minnesota, but that didn't go very far. He didn't gain much traction. So I think Gavin Newsom's the only person who's there now in the public eye who could take his place. Could there be someone else? Maybe, who's not like even on the horizon now? Possibly, but I don't see who that person is. And that's why the Democrats are a bit stuck, but not entirely. I think if they get desperate enough and they see Biden as a liability, they could do some last-minute replacement. Any other questions? Yes, I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming.
Okay. Ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. So let's talk about tradition.
Okay.
So usually the incumbent, right? If he's eligible to run, does so, along with the vice president that was chosen, right?
Right.
We have talked a lot about possibilities here, but we haven't talked or spoken about our actual vice president right now.
Her
What
name
are
has
your
not come up
opinions on
yet
that?
today.
Not once. And just your thoughts on that.
My thoughts on that are this, and I should have mentioned her as a logical replacement for Biden, except for one thing. Her poll numbers are lower than his. And we can get into the reasons why. I'd prefer not to, because there are many reasons that have been given as to why her poll numbers are low. I think part of it is the Democrats have not used her, Kamala Harris, in the right way. And it's led to this perception that she's just kind of out there doing nothing. I know that she's been campaigning about abortion rights recently, and so maybe she found her footing. But her poll numbers are so low that they feel that one liability will be replaced by another. And I think that's why Democrats have been hesitant to say, okay, you're the next in line. Why don't you just run for the presidency now versus wait your turn? That has not happened. There is absolutely no traction, as far as I can see, to have her replace Biden.
So how do you think the Democratic Party is going to reconcile that with a population that voted for him because she was on the ballot?
Well, if we go back to those statistics, I want to show you something. And that is the black vote. Is that what you're referring to? Mm-hmm. Right. So traditionally, over the last many election cycles, the Democratic candidate has gotten 90% and upwards of the black vote. 90% and upwards. Barack Obama got like 96%. But not just Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton got something like 91% of the black vote in 2016. That has become almost the norm in the Democratic Party. But look at those numbers. You might say, well, Trump only gets 18% of the black vote. That's not the point. The point is that Biden is only getting around 77. That's a 14, 15, 16% drop from where the Democrats have been. And so maybe it would be a good strategy to put Kamala Harris more on a pedestal, because she could perhaps get much greater numbers. But Biden is lagging when it comes to the black vote, and that is very problematic. And he's also lagging with the Hispanic vote. It's pretty close. It's only 8 points. And traditionally, Democrats get about 65, 66% of the Hispanic vote. So his numbers are low when it comes to the people who traditionally, speaking of tradition, vote Democrat. How a Harris presidency would play into that is very interesting. And chances are she'd get more with the black vote, but she'd probably get less elsewhere. Perhaps when it comes to men and women, those numbers would be wider advantage to Trump if Kamala Harris ran when it came to men voting for it. Because I think there's a bit of misogyny there too. The fact that she's a woman, that is a problem for some people in America still. That's an interesting experiment. Kelly?
I actually have a question about her too. Talk about her kind of being pushed to the side for all intents and purposes. Has there been any successes that she's had? And I'm sure that there are. I'm just not that delved deep into it.
Yeah,
that maybe they could capitalize on if they wanted to use her as a candidate.
They think that the abortion issue is a winning issue for them. And the fact that she's going around the country, especially in states where abortion rights have been truncated, they've been kind of set back, I think that is a good strategy for the Democratic Party. The problem is when Biden first took office, they said she was going to be the immigration czar, the border czar, and that has not materialized. Not really because it's her fault. There is no solution for the border crisis, if we want to call it that, without input from both the Republican and Democratic parties in Congress. And Congress has lagged behind, hasn't done anything on the border. Both sides have been using it as like a bludgeon to damage the other side rather than truly develop a comprehensive border policy issue. And so she got off to a really bad start, not of her own doing, because of the way the Democratic Party thought to use her. And she's had various other roles. I think she traveled overseas to meet with foreign leaders in Western Europe for a bit of time. Not much came of that. So whatever way they've used her, it hasn't worked to their advantage. And it's made her seem like a kind of hollow candidate. Again, much of it is not her fault. I do think, her speaking sometimes, she doesn't have too much to say in depth when it comes to certain issues, but in other ways, she's articulate and she's knowledgeable, she's smart, but it hasn't been trumpeted, for lack of a better term, as much as it should be. Any other questions or thoughts? Hi, Jamie. How you doing? Jamie used to be one of our students, is now at UConn, but he's come back to visit. Thank you for coming. I want to thank all of you for coming to the event. I know it's not a big crowd. I do wish there were more students. When you do hear of these events, if you could get other students to come, that would be great. I do want to thank also the faculty for coming. We have some of our most loyal supporters here of civic engagement, and it's good to see that. And Mike, thank you for videotaping, as always. He's our video guru. Do we call these podcasts or just videos? I think they're not podcasts, really, right? They're on YouTube. They'll be on YouTube, so I'll send the link out to whomever wants it. Just let me know once I get it. All right. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. I appreciate you listening. And if you're interested in the certificate in civic engagement, please let me know. Have a good day.